Good evening from the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore. Good evening if you're joining us from Asia. Good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe. Good morning if you've got up early enough to join us in North America. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the Executive Director of the IISS Asia office, and we're here this evening to launch our new report on global cyber power. The report that we've launched today at the IISS provides a qualitative methodology for assessing countries based on their cyber power. How good are they at defensive and offensive cyber capabilities? And it also gives a ranking of 15 cyber nations that we have picked into different tiers to give you a sense of how they fare against one another. And so what we're going to do this evening, you can see the front cover of the report next to me, is we're going to discuss the report and its findings, some of which are quite surprising, with a panel of 3 experts who have contributed to the report, and then have a discussion and then take some questions. So let me introduce our participants for this evening. So sitting to my right here in the office is Dr. Greg Austin, who's a senior fellow at IISS in our Cyber, Space and Future Conflict program. Greg was one of the main co-authors of this report, but this has been a work with many hands. Greg was only one of the authors. There are a dozen other participants in this research program, and 2 more of them join us this evening. So if I turn to the television, first, we have Dr. Gil Baram, who is a research fellow at the Blavatnik Cyber Research Center at Tel Aviv University, and she joins us this evening from Israel. And then Elina Nour, who is the Director of Political and Security Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and she joins us this morning from Washington, D.C. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me just lay out what we're going to do in this event this evening. So we're going to run for 1 hour and 15 minutes. When I've finished speaking, in just a second, I'm going to hand over to Greg, and Greg is going to give you an overview of the report for about 10 minutes. What were the main findings, and how did we come about making those findings? Then I will hand over to our 2 respondents, to Elina and to Gil. They'll speak for about 5 minutes each and give some perspectives on the report from their own particular vantage points as cyber experts. And then the 3 of us will have a discussion about the findings, and then we'll open up for questions from our audience around the world this evening. So we encourage you to ask questions. To do so, you'll be watching on Zoom, and you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. Keep your questions fairly brief, and please give us your name and the institution, if you have an institution that you're writing from, and then we'll pick as many of those questions as we can as we go through, and we'll wrap up in about 1 hour and 15 minutes time. So with that, let me stop, and I'll hand over to my colleague Greg Austin to give you a sense of how this report came about, what its methodology was, and what its main findings have been. So Greg, over to you.
Thank you, James, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. The IISS effort here in analysing cyber capabilities and national power has 2 broad aims. The first aim is to understand the fundamentals of power in cyberspace, new power relationships in the information age. But we're also interested in how countries apply that power for all sorts of military operations, political operations, and diplomatic operations. So we don't go into those in the report in a lot of detail, but this is really a report that serves 2 purposes. As I mentioned, assessing the fundamentals of cyber power and then laying the groundwork for further analysis by IISS of things like offensive cyber operations, cyber coercion, and similar. So let me start first with one of the surprises of this report. We all have a view of the relative cyber power of China and the United States, or many of us do. And what I was surprised to learn from this exercise that we went through, this methodical approach, was that we were able to demonstrate quite a clear gap, a visible gap, between China and the United States in almost every aspect of cyber power. And while I'd thought for a long time that China was lagging behind the United States in broad terms, I was actually surprised to see how comprehensive that lagging was. So we were able in this report to draw a clear distinction between China's cyber power and that of the United States. Let me first say, though, that there's a bit of a problem with the methodology in this report, in that we're relying on what you might call asymmetric sources. Cyber capabilities really depend on some of the most secret capabilities a state possesses, whether it's in their intelligence agencies or the security agencies. And so we really have an incomplete picture of the cyber power of countries, and we rely very heavily on what you might call selective leaking, selective sources in how we conduct this analysis. That said, the people involved in this report believe that we can have reasonably high confidence in our findings because we were able to compare and contrast the sorts of findings we were looking at with what leaders in the countries we were studying were actually saying themselves. We're also able to compare our findings with what people who work on these subjects in government in certain countries also were able to establish. So let me introduce at that point our methodological categories for analysing the cyber power of a state. So Angie, if we could have the first slide on methodology, please, I'd be most grateful. So you can see 7 categories on that slide. The first is strategy and doctrine. The second is governance, command and control. The third is core cyber intelligence capability. And let me just say there that people in the past who've studied national cyber power have typically not paid as much attention to core cyber intelligence capability as we do in our study. The fourth category is cyber empowerment and dependence, looking both at the degree to which a country has a degree of independence in its ICT supply system, what's the vibrancy of its digital economy. But the other side of that is the degree to which a state is dependent upon international connectivity and a highly digitized economy in a way that increases its vulnerability. So the next category was cybersecurity and national resilience. So this is the proposition that states really can't exercise power in cyberspace unless they can secure their own systems. And while systems, of course, are always going to be attacked and some attacks will succeed, it's important for countries to have resilience arrangements in place. So cybersecurity and resilience are really two sides of the same coin. The next category was global leadership in cyberspace affairs. And while this may sound a little bit unrelated to cyber power, we were convinced at the start, and our work demonstrated the value of the proposition, that how a state acts diplomatically in cyberspace can actually reinforce what you might think about its inherent national cyber power. The final category we looked at was offensive cyber operations, and we believe that these are a fundamental indicator of a state's ability to exert power in cyberspace. So we're talking about exerting power in cyberspace. So that was our methodology. Angie, I wonder if we could now go to the slide which shows our findings, please. So on the slide you'll see 3 tiers. We decided to group the 15 countries that we studied into 3 tiers of cyber power. We decided that only one country satisfied the criteria for inclusion in Tier 1. So the criteria for inclusion in Tier 1 were world-leading strengths in all of those 7 categories of cyber power that we talked about. That's world-leading strengths in all 7 categories of cyber power, and we assessed that only the United States met that broad criterion. For the second tier of cyber power, we made an assessment that we could group together states which had world-leading strengths in several elements of cyber power. So that's world-leading strengths in several elements of cyber power, but not all, and perhaps weaknesses in some others. And you can see there that we've grouped together an interesting grab bag of countries almost. So perhaps China and Russia might be regarded as clearly second tier behind the United States. Some people would logically put the United Kingdom there as well. But not everybody would put countries like Australia, Israel, France and Canada in the same tier of cyber power as China and Russia. So we can explain that perhaps later, but that's where we ended up with tier 2. Our third tier of cyber power was for countries which had strengths or potential strengths in some categories, but significant weaknesses in others. So in that category of the 15 countries we studied, we placed India, Indonesia, Iran, Japan, Malaysia, North Korea and Vietnam. Now, you'll all appreciate that these countries are very different in the way they manifest cyber power. They're very different in the way they use cyber power. So the fact that they're all tiered together is not meant to be saying that they're similar in most aspects of cyber power. In fact, they're quite dissimilar in how they have collected the attributes of cyber power. So thank you, Angie, for that slide. So let's return to the surprises that we found in the report. The second big surprise for me was the absolute centrality of the digital economy as a determinant of national cyber power. Now, that might seem sort of obvious, but as we dug into the specifics of each country, we found that the science and technology underpinnings of the digital economy and the skills base and the university, the quality of university education in each country actually spoke a lot to the cyber power of each country, because the university system and the digital economy flow into all of the other aspects of cyber power, whether it's your core intelligence cyber capability, whether it's your cybersecurity and national resilience, or whether it's your offensive cyber capability. And in another sort of interesting angle, even on the international stage, it's your level of appeal to other countries as an international partner, which you need to reinforce your own cybersecurity. You have to have that level of appeal and partnership that will attract other countries. So that's really another big surprise that we found about this study in cyber power. So apart from the fundamental strength of the digital economy, we looked to political leadership and political will. The report doesn't analyse this in depth in each chapter, each country study, but we regard it as fundamentally important, and we tried to capture it in a sort of brief historical overview of the way in which these countries had approached the development of cyber power. So political will, the system of political organisation is fundamentally important. The style and the quality of government are what delivers outcomes in cyberspace. And I think if we return to briefly to the comparison between the United States and China, and we look at the different style of government, the different systems of government, we can see inefficiencies in both, of course, but I think that it's our assessment that the governance, the command and control that we see in the direction of cyber policy in the United States, no matter how inadequate it looks as we see attack after attack succeeding, that style of governance and the level of organisation and efficiency in the United States system was superior to what we can see in China. So that's a very broad introduction to the report. It took us 2 years. We've analysed 15 countries. We selected those 15 countries on the basis of several criteria. We wanted a broad geographic representation. We wanted different levels of cyber capability. And of course, we wanted to pick off the main actors in different confrontations that we see in cyberspace. So that's how we arrived at the countries. We will now be going ahead with additional country studies. We've already completed 7 more, which will be published later this year. And by the time we finish our research on these country studies, we expect to have reached 40 in total. So look forward to working with colleagues on how we take those country studies forward and the sorts of conclusions we might find, and whether or not they reinforce the quality of this methodology or cause us to adjust it in some way. Let me stop there, James. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Just before we go on to our respondents, let me ask you a couple of questions. So you touched on there why it is that we picked some countries and not others. There are some countries you might expect to be on that list. So we're here in Singapore, Germany, South Korea, some quite technologically advanced countries didn't make the list. So just say a little bit more about why these 15 and not some of the others.
Well, thank you, James. We had a choice to make between covering what you might call broad categories of states in international affairs. So we really ended up with three broad categories. One was membership in US-led alliances. So we picked the 4 of the 5 IISS countries, and we looked at a couple of other close allies of the United States, Japan, Israel, and France. If we'd added other close allies of the United States, we would have created an even larger impression that we were, in a sense, focusing too heavily on the US-led intelligence alliances and the US strategic alliances. We had to look at this other group in international affairs in cyberspace, the group that the United States and some of its allies complain about most often. So Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So we've got 7 countries, the United States and 6 allies, and we've got 4 countries which are really quite visibly opposed to the United States in strategic policy in all sorts of ways. And then we decided we should pick 4 countries from the other side of the digital divide, if you like. Those countries which are less capable in cyberspace, which in a sense fall between the strategic blocks, if we can imagine the US alliance and those other countries as blocks. So in a sense they represent non-aligned strategic policy to a large degree, although that's changing under the impact of events in cyberspace and other events, but also different levels of development. Thanks.
Very good. And let me just ask one more question before we go to our respondents, which is, as this report was launched today, every single one of the newspaper headlines that it has garnered have focused on the balance between the US and China. So I just want, before we dive in, you give us a little bit more context on that. As I have understood the report, the IISS says that the US is at least 10 years ahead of China in its cyber capabilities, which is quite a big claim, but equally that China is catching up and is the only country that is on a trajectory at some point in the future to reach the level that the United States has presently reached. So just tell us a little bit more about that and in a sense the trajectory that the 2 global superpowers are on in the assessment of the report, and then we'll go to Elina and Gil for some more perspectives.
Well, thank you, James. Well, briefly, the one-word answer to that question is time. It takes time to accumulate the foundational elements of cyber power. And we can look very clearly at what the Chinese leaders have said about where they were in cyber power beginning in the year 2000 through to the point in 2014 where President Xi Jinping said, we want to become a cyber power. In 2018, Xi Jinping upgraded that ambition. He wanted China to become a cyber superpower. And that sort of time frame we're talking about from 2000 to 2014 or 2000 to 2021, 2 decades is simply not enough to build the fundamental foundations of what you might call highly effective cyber power. And if we compare the history of China with the history of the United States, we see that the United States has lived in relative peace and relative prosperity, domestically at least, for many decades, 7 or 8 decades you might say, and whereas China has not had that luxury. So China's had to rebuild its industry or build its industry from scratch. It's had to reconstitute universities. And it's got a long way to go yet. And for the Chinese leaders to set their ambitions on a time frame like 2035 is entirely appropriate in our view. And so if you read closely what the Chinese leaders are saying about where they've come from and where they want to go and where they've arrived at now, I think we can appreciate their understanding that time matters and they haven't quite arrived at that end point of that progress yet to becoming a fully fledged cyber power of the sort that the United States clearly is. Thank you.
Great. So let's turn over to our two respondents. So Gil, I'll come to you first in Tel Aviv. So you were one of the contributors from the report, but equally you're a cyber expert. So let me hand over to you and give us some of your perspectives on how we should judge cyber power and what it means. Gil, over to you.
Thank you, James. So first, I just want to say that I found the report to be a tremendous value for understanding of national cyber capabilities. I think it presents an innovative methodology and provides both comprehensive view of countries' current position and also a brief look at possible future options that might come. And in that sense, I found it highly important one. So I would like to touch briefly on three related points, and maybe we can expand on this later. So my first point has to do with one of the criteria in the report, and specifically the category of core cyber intelligence capabilities. The role of intelligence agencies in cyber conflict has been receiving a growing amount of attention lately in both research and practice. Traditionally, intelligence agencies have been operating covertly. However, in recent years, we see that cyber intrusions between nation states are constantly on the rise, and so is the amount of information being publicized. This trend and the information that is being revealed may shed new light on the way these agencies work in this context. So, since this trend is bound to continue, it's essential to pay attention to the changing role and practices of intelligence agencies in cyber attacks and intrusions. And this report really breaks a new ground in identifying this as an important criteria and establish a baseline for future research and monitoring. My second point regards countries that served as a kind of a testing ground for other countries' offensive cyber capabilities, and how this may affect their motivation to develop their own defensive or offensive cyber capabilities. A few countries that weren't included in this report, like Estonia, Ukraine, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia, they all suffered major cyber attacks from other nation states, specifically from Russia and Iran. Estonia, for example, was hit with a major cyber attack in 2007, and today is a cyber defense leader within NATO and Europe, and is ranked 5th in the world according to the Global Cybersecurity Index of the ITU. Iran could be another example for that. Experts believe that the Stuxnet attack that hit Iran nuclear facilities in 2010 was a catalyst for its development and improvement of offensive cyber capabilities. So, suffering a major cyber attack may change the way countries perceive their cyber threat and give them incentives to invest in their own cyber capabilities. It may even become a predictor for future capabilities. And this is something I think might be really interesting to examine in future research. My third point concerns the ability of countries to steal and reuse nation-states' offensive cyber tools and vulnerabilities, and how this might affect their cyber capabilities and national power. We can think, for example, the NotPetya and WannaCry attacks from 2017 that were two highly destructive ones, both made of offensive cyber tools that were originally developed by the National Security Agency, stolen, circulated by the group called Shadow Brokers, and shared with the public. Reuse of stolen cyber tools may affect the distribution of international cyber power. Weaker states can use sophisticated malwares to cause global damage and possibly even use the stolen cyber weapons against their original designers. So countries that are less technologically advanced and less vulnerable to cyber attacks might find the reuse of stolen vulnerabilities appealing for their own offensive activities, and that in turn might affect the national cyber power. This too may be a component of national cyber power worth following. I will stop here to stay on the clock, and thank you.
Thank you, Gil. Now let me turn from Israel to Washington, D.C., and turn over to Elina Nour from the Asia Society Policy Institute. So Elina, do you want to give us your response to the report in which you were also a contributor?
Yes, thank you, James. Let me first commend the qualitative methodology and big picture view this report takes. By zooming out to cover the different categories that Greg talked about, the report, I think, manages to do two things at once: provide a common baseline assessment, while also highlighting the various priorities and perspectives of each country covered. And this is reflected, for example, in the greater immediate focus we see on the digital economy and e-government services by developing countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, compared to the strategic interests of more established and technologically advanced economies such as the Five Eyes Alliance. Now, 3 quick points from me as well. First, although this report confines itself to assessing the cyber capabilities of state actors, its coverage of countries' cyber-industrial complex does prompt the question of the role of the private sector in enhancing national power, along with its responsibility to international peace and security. The 2013 Snowden leaks revealed that the distinction between authoritarian and liberal democratic regimes may not be a purely clean and binary one after all, especially when it comes to the co-optation of private companies for cyber core intelligence activities. Additionally, we're now also seeing geopolitical rivalry play out in international standards setting bodies, governance frameworks, as well as through tit-for-tat efforts such as the United States Clean Network Initiative under the Trump administration and China's Global Data Security Initiative. This cleaving of the cyber domain and the industries and supply chains that anchor it is ironic given just how close and interdependent technology is supposed to make us, particularly if this contestation is one to be based on political ideology. It's especially comforting for those countries in Southeast Asia that do not necessarily share the same threat perceptions or risk profiles as larger powers do, but are nonetheless increasingly cornered into choosing one vision of cyberspace over another. Second, as Spider-Man's grandfather, who may or may not have been a cyber guru, said, with great power comes great responsibility. And this responsibility is observed through conforming with norms in international law, as affirmed by the recent reports of the 2 parallel UN cyber-related processes, the Open-Ended Working Group and the Group of Governmental Experts. In that regard, the rise in sophisticated cyber attacks below the threshold of international law, such as advanced persistent threats that regularly probe a system's defenses, or the hacking of networks for longer-term strategic value, is disturbing. And equally disturbing is the countering of these threats by ambiguous concepts that walk the fine line between offensive and defensive operations, and that stretch the limits of self-defense in international law, potentially resulting in unintended, escalatory, and destabilizing consequences for third-party states caught in the crossfire, and other cyber stakeholders more generally. Now, I don't want to end in an ominous note, so my third and final point is this. This report, I think, provides a good measure of states' strengths and weaknesses. This can, in turn, support ongoing cyber capacity building efforts based on those very strengths and weaknesses. Of course, as the UN Open-Ended Working Group and Group of Governmental Experts make clear, capacity building efforts should be politically neutral, without conditions, and reciprocal. This report can add to the growing pool of resources on narrowing the technological divide, if indeed states aim to cooperate and collaborate more than they aim to divide and conquer in cyberspace. I'm happy to pick up on any of these points later, but let me stop here for now, and thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you, Elina. Thank you, Gil. So let's have a period of discussion. Thank you very much for those of you who've already asked questions. On my iPad here, I can see that we've got a reasonably long list, but please do put your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom if you want to ask a question either to Greg or to either of our two respondents this evening. But Greg, let's take a practical example. So every week or two, we now seem to get some blockbuster cyber attack somewhere in the world, a ransomware attack or something of that sort. The most recent has been the Colonial Pipeline in the United States, where hackers, widely presumed to be Russian, took out a piece of critical infrastructure. So given that it's typically Americans that are the victims of these attacks, could you explain a little bit about what did we learn from Colonial Pipeline? And in a sense, if America is so good at cyber, as our report claims, then why do they keep getting hit by all of these attacks? Why can't they stop them?
Well, thank you, James. A very good question. The section of our report, the section of our methodology that deals with this particular challenge is titled Cybersecurity and Resilience. They're really two sides of the same coin. We note in the report that no government in the world is satisfied with their cyber defences. So, for example, the United States, which we say is the most powerful cyber country in the world, has issued a national emergency in cyberspace for 5 years in a row, beginning in 2015. So the attacks will keep coming. It's not possible to defend against all of the attacks. The best defences available will not protect you in cyberspace. I'm not saying that all defences are weak. Some defences are definitely stronger than others. But once you add the human element and the organisational element and chance to the equation, then the prospect of quite serious cyber attacks like the attack on Colonial Pipeline are certainly going to occur from time to time. What it tells us is what we need to know most about is not that the cyber attacks will keep coming, but what is our level of resilience against these attacks and how do we recover from them? And I think what we saw in the Colonial attack was a relatively low level of preparation for resilience and recovery around the flow-on effects of the cyber attack. So while specialists hurried to deal with the ransomware challenge that was delivered through that cyber attack, there wasn't as much preparedness to deal with the shortages of fuel that resulted from it. So as we go forward, states have to be better prepared for cybersecurity, but they have to be far better prepared for cyber resilience. And this is one area where the United States is decades ahead of its nearest competitor, China. We don't detail it much in the report, but very close examination of China's preparedness for the flow-on effects of dangerous cyber attacks is clearly not as good as that of the United States. Thank you, James.
Let me pick up one other question. So I'll ask this first to you, Greg, and then Gil, I think you also dealt with this, which is in the report you talk about a cyber industrial complex, which sounds very sinister, but actually you mean it in a quite positive sense, as in if you have one of these things, you are much more likely to be a cyber power, and America has one of the best. And in a sense, you're arguing, I think, that China has a less well-developed cyber industrial complex than some of the other countries. So give us a sense of what does that mean? What's the cyber industrial complex, and why is it so useful to have one?
Well, the cyber industrial complex, as we understand it, is obviously a play on the original concept of military industrial complex. And it really is about the ability of a state and its private sector to marshal resources in a way to build powerful assets which can be used internationally for the interests of the state in all sorts of ways. And the original idea of military industrial complex, of course, had negative connotations. Cyber industrial complex really doesn't have the same political background or the same baggage, but we can imagine, in both ways, both good and bad. But the cyber industrial complex is best represented by the huge number of corporations in the United States who operate globally, who have been operating globally for some decades, have been, in a sense, continually, merging and acquiring other firms, getting bigger and bigger. And the cyber-industrial complex also comprises that network of research institutions, scholars, technologists, investors, and governments who deliver the regulations to, in a sense, help this beast thrive. And I think that one of the things that marks the United States out, perhaps from every other country in the world, is the laissez-faire attitude, or the relatively laissez-faire attitude that governments have had to regulation of the technology sector. So we could say a lot about the cyber-industrial complex, but it is a useful tool for analysing this aspect of the digital economy and cyber power. Thank you, James.
So I'm trying to unpick here what it is at the core of this report. What is it that the United States and some of the wealthier industrial democracies have that makes them successful, and what is it that other countries are trying to do to catch up? So Gil, feel free to address this question of the cyber-industrial complex, but you also made the point about the integration of intelligence agencies and the changed role of intelligence agencies in this new cyber economy. As we've said, one of the oddities of cyber is it's all very secretive, and so intelligence agencies are the most secretive of these kind of agencies. But I think you have some thoughts on the changing role of intelligence agencies as part of this cyber-industrial complex. So Gil, over to you.
Thank you, James. So I want to just touch upon the previous subject. I want to share maybe some thoughts from Israel. Here we talk about cyber ecosystem. That means that the government and the universities and the industry are working together and sharing knowledge, and manpower is moving from these three bodies, and this is something that contribute a lot to the position of Israel right now, that the tight connections between the government, the industry, and the universities. And regarding the question about intelligence agencies, I think what we're seeing in the past few years is that intelligence agencies, we see it especially in the US, are becoming more public. They need to, if the US, for example, wants to attribute a cyber intrusion or a cyber attack to another country, it needs to show evidence. And these kind of evidence are materials that the intelligence agencies have. And so we see much more public appearance of the intelligence agencies, much more than before. Thank you.
Let me ask Elina, so a question for you. You mentioned this in the report. We talk about the balance of offensive and defensive cyber attacks. So are you the one doing the hacking, or are you the one being hacked? Could you just say a little bit more about that? I mean, the point being that those who are in Tier 1 and Tier 2, I presume, are good at both of these things. But in your initial remarks, you made a distinction between how countries consider the offensive and defensive and why you have to be good at both. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is that there are countries such as Australia, I believe, that openly admit to having offensive cyber capabilities. And these countries feel that it makes for a more transparent environment in cyberspace with the declaration of such offensive capabilities. Where I think it gets a little hairy is when countries talk about defensive operations, particularly at the tactical level, with the strategic value of being offensive. And so here I'm referring to concepts such as persistent engagement or defend forward that the US government, particularly on the side of the Department of Defense and Cyber Command, have put forward. And I think the US is trying to sort out these distinctions because it creates this confusion over what exactly is offensive and what exactly is defensive. There are very real implications in international law with such blurry distinctions. And I think it would do very well for the larger cyber environment, and particularly for those of us caught in the middle, I say us, countries in Southeast Asia, who don't want to be on the unintended receiving end of these half offensive, half defensive cyber operations.
So just unpack that for a little. I'm going to come to Southeast Asia in just a second, first to you and then to Greg, but unpack that a little bit for the people watching who aren't experts. So you said cyber forward operations, and so I think what we mean by that is that if you want to be defensive, you've actually got to go and hack the hackers, right? So can you just explain what you mean by that? What is this blurring of offensive and defensive? Maybe give us a practical example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so some operations that have been made public as part of the US DoD's Defend Forward concept have been where the US has gone into other jurisdictions, usually with the consent of those states, to hack into networks that are resident in those jurisdictions. And usually, as I said, it's done with the collaboration of the host nation. But we don't know whether there have been other operations where there may have been intrusions into other jurisdictions' networks that may possibly not be as compliant with the US's request. And so I think there's this real concern over the intrusion of operations into particular states' networks without their consent or with some sort of reluctance on their part because of some other cooptation in other areas, be they economic or diplomatic. So that's what I'm happy to elaborate if you need more clarity.
No, that's great. You mentioned Southeast Asia, so we're based here in Singapore in our office of the IISS. So one of the interesting things about the report is, although you have the big countries you might expect at the top, so the US and China and Russia, actually the cyber rankings that we have suggest that some countries that you might think would be great players are slightly less good, countries like India and Japan, whereas others, as Greg said, are better. Canada, Australia rank more highly than perhaps you might think from simple ranking of states geopolitically. But what about the countries in the ranking? We had Malaysia, Vietnam, countries like that. How did they fare in these rankings? Increasingly technologically sophisticated, poorer or middle income countries in somewhere like Southeast Asia. So say a little bit about that, and then I'll come back to Greg to talk more about China.
There's a bit of a gap between aspiration and reality. And I think the reality is that although countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam covered in the report want to advance their technological capabilities primarily for the digital economy, the reality is that there is a lot of catching up to do. And it goes back to what Greg was saying about the foundational elements of building that cyber power. It goes back to education. The lack of science and technology focus, particularly at the secondary or even elementary levels in many of these countries. In some cases, there's also the language barrier. A lot of science and technology subjects are taught in English, and English is not necessarily the native or primary languages of many of these countries in Southeast Asia. So there are a lot of these basic hurdles to overcome in order for countries in Southeast Asia to get to even tier 2 of the IISS methodology.
Great. Greg, let's talk more about China. So if you're Xi Jinping, and you read the IISS report and you're a second-tier nation in this ranking, and you want to do something about it, then what should you be focusing on? You've mentioned a few things already. So we've talked about the cyber-industrial complex, and your point about education is well made, but be a bit more specific. So if you were to write a memo to Xi Jinping about how to get to tier 1, what would be in it?
Well, thank you, James. The answer is, in a sense, as complex as it is simple. So it's complex in the sense that there are many moving parts in a national innovation system. We've referred to several already. It's the private sector corporations, it's the government agencies and their procurement, and it's the university and the researchers, the quality of the science and technology sector. So in a sense, mobilizing all of those different elements and attracting venture capital and other forms of investment is quite a complex process. On the other hand, as Xi Jinping himself has said, it really boils down to this one question of talent and how you mobilize it. And Xi Jinping made a speech in 2018, which was only just publicized in the last few months, in which he said, hard power or soft power, it doesn't matter what power you're talking about, it all depends on talent. Now, we've heard the talent argument from the Chinese leadership for probably 15 to 20 years in terms of how to construct that innovator class in China. But by and large, they've not succeeded at the rate that they want to. And building up the university system, transforming the university system in a way that it can produce the innovator class is an important challenge. China has interestingly sidestepped this requirement a little bit, but at the same time it's paid the price in terms of foreign innovation or domestic innovation. So one of the main sources of new patents in China are in fact foreign invested laboratories. So there's something like 700 or 800 foreign invested research laboratories in China, and it turns out these are primary sources of a very large number of Chinese issued patents. So that's one way of solving the talent problem. Again, these are long processes. Reforming university systems, they're notoriously conservative. It's almost as hard to reform a university system as it is to reform the armed forces of a country or the civil service. So it's really tough. The Chinese know it is. They've been trying hard. The World Bank, as early as 2010, laid out the reform plan for China if it wanted to develop as an advanced information society. And these papers written by the World Bank were always co-authored, in a sense, by the Chinese government as well. So that focus on talent development has been there non-stop. But I'm afraid Xi Jinping has been in power now since 2012, November 2012. He laid out a massive reform agenda within 1 year of becoming the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, but really he hasn't been able to live up to that. And so that's what's required, is for the Chinese leaders to implement those very policies which they say themselves are essential, and to quicken the pace of that reform process and that modernisation process. Thank you, James.
Great. Let's go over to some questions from the audience. I've got a whole list here. I'm going to try and rattle through as many as I can. Many of these are going to go to Greg, but I'll go back to Gil and Elena as we can do. And so I'll try and take a good smattering of different geographies. So Nitin Pai from the Takshashila Institution in Bangalore in India. So Nitin asks, it was interesting to see in the report the line that the US hacks networks, but Russia and China hack minds. So Greg, can you explain what you mean by that? And Nitin asks, does the Chinese strategy get to the heart of the matter? Is there something distinct about that approach to cyber power?
Well, I think that it's fair to say that China and Russia have a longer history of what you might call information warfare as classically understood, psychological warfare, political warfare, whatever sort of term you want to use. The intelligence services in the Soviet Union lived and breathed this form of information warfare. I think it was as early as 1977, the Soviet Union set up its Ministry of Information, just like the George Orwell book 1984. China has a very long history of the manipulation of public information for political influencing, both domestically and abroad. Of course, it's gone up and down in different cycles. So in a sense, their system is more attuned to hacking the mind than perhaps the United States system. The United States has very clear regulations for its military personnel and its intelligence agencies in terms of what can be done in terms of quote-unquote hacking the mind, and by that I mean political influencing operations. That said, and I believe that that particular statement in the report was probably attributed to a research scholar, the The United States is not unknown. Well, we know the United States undertakes political influence operations of the same sort as Russia and China. We know less detail about them, but on the record, we know that on several occasions in the past 40 years, the United States President has issued an intelligence finding in which he authorises psychological warfare and political warfare against other countries. And in the more recent past, we have specific cases on the record where the President of the United States has ordered combined cyber and psychological operations against foreign countries. So on the one hand, China and Russia definitely have traditions that are different from the United States, but the United States does do it, although under different frameworks of law and in a sense under different historical organisational influences. Thank you.
Let me take a question here from Benjamin Go. So Benjamin works for GovTech, which is one of the tech agencies, not a cyber agency per se, but the tech agency here in Singapore. And so Ben asks, are we seeing countries collaborate with one another in order to improve their cyber capabilities, so to try and move from tier 2 up to tier 1 or from tier 3 up to tier 2, or are they all competing against one another? So you've already mentioned the Five Eyes security network, Greg, but maybe in general, do countries share what they're up to with one another, or is this a very secretive area? And I might also ask Gil this question as well. So Greg.
Sure. Of course, countries are trying to collaborate with each other more to address a vast range of problems in cyberspace, especially to do with the security of systems, but also broader issues of national security. And we've seen that in Asia especially, with India getting much closer towards the United States. Japan, Australia and the United States signed an agreement, or at least published an agreement on better cooperation in cyberspace to enhance security. But there is an obstacle, and the obstacle is trust. So the Japanese government, for example, has made pretty plain that it would be very keen to join the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. That's probably never going to happen because of the historic foundations of trust and information sharing that exist in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. But that doesn't mean that the Five Eyes countries can't cooperate closely with Japan in certain areas, especially mutual defence. So I have a piece coming out in Nikkei tomorrow which talks about the benefit to Japan of closer collaboration with the United States for defence against possible attacks in connection with the Tokyo Olympics. Let me stop there, James. Thank you.
Let's ask a couple of oh, well, actually, I said I'd ask Gil if you also had any thoughts on cooperation and collaboration. Gil?
Yeah, thank you, James. I completely agree with Greg. I just wanted to further mention the recent collaboration between Iran and Russia and China, that this side of the map is collaborating too.
Okay, let's ask a couple of specific country questions. So from Taipei, Tim Culpen, who's a columnist for Bloomberg View. So Tim asks, a few states do surprisingly well in some cyber rankings, and he talks about Malaysia being amongst them. And I think in this respect, he's probably thinking slightly less about our report and the quantitative report, which was put out by the International Telecoms Union, which put Malaysia as a top-tier cyber power. So, Elina, this sounds like one for you. So, what are a few reasons that in some of these rankings, a country like Malaysia does relatively well, and in others like ours, it's one of the tier 3 nations?
For a country like Malaysia, which has long been trying to make headways into the digital space, I think you have the evidence of policies and strategies that date back to the 1980s. You also have Malaysia having been represented at the UN Group of Governmental Experts, and a number of technical angles as well that I think have contributed to Malaysia's ranking in such as the ITU's report. So Malaysia, for example, and this is detailed in the IISS report, every year executes a public and private partnership exercise that aims to enhance resilience against cyber attacks. And I think the combination of some of these factors, policy, technical, as well as the legal frameworks that are in place, have boosted Malaysia's ranking in other matrices as well.
Greg, North Korea. So North Korea is always, they're hacking Sony Pictures, all sorts of meddling. So question here from Murari Kalyanarami. He's the Chief Information Security Officer for UOB Bank, one of the biggest banks here in Singapore. And he says it was interesting to see North Korea not being rated highly for their cyber offensive capabilities. So you'd think that they'd score very highly. Apparently they don't. So why is that?
Well, very interesting question. Thank you, Muri. North Korea is definitely hyperactive in cyberspace, and it has this long record of criminal activity in cyberspace to raise money, to steal money. It has this patchy record of offensive cyber operations against several foreign countries, most notably perhaps against the United States. Its profile against South Korea is a little worrying. So some of its espionage activities have gone a bit too close to the nuclear power company in South Korea. But by and large, according to many assessments, North Korea has more or less dropped back to a criminal cyber actor from about 2017 onwards, maybe 2018 onwards. And whether that was the result of US deterrence activities. So remember, after the Sony Pictures attack, the United States said, we will retaliate, and we will retaliate either in cyberspace or using other means. And so it's just possible that the United States government retaliated adequately to deter North Korea from this path of further attacks against US interests apart from espionage. But if you look closely at the education system in North Korea and the digital economy, you reach the conclusion very quickly that North Korea's power in cyberspace is very thinly based. If you were to compare the volume of known cyber attacks from North Korea with the volume of known cyber attacks from Russia, you'd probably come up with a ratio of something like 10 to 1 at least in favor of Russia. So as the Chief Information Security Officer of a bank, you have very strong reasons to be careful and take precautions against North Korea. If you're talking about North Korea using offensive cyber operations to achieve a political and military victory over an enemy country, we don't believe it can quite do that. Thanks.
Great. Let me ask a couple of questions about resources. And Greg, I'm going to go to you again for this. So Antoine Laviscu, who's one of our colleagues here at IISS. So Antoine asks, does the report offer any help to policymakers facing the choice to allocate additional resources, as in, which of these 7 categories should you be trying to spend your money on? And I had a related question from Randy Lieberman, who's the Chief Executive Officer of HOT, and he says, thinking about a world of great power competition between the US and China, to what extent does this report offer a wake-up call for the US to be spending more money on cyber to, I presume, maintain its advantage, given that's what the report says? And if so, what should they be spending that money on? So, Greg.
Thank you, James. Well, if we go to the second part of the question first, I think that the answer is countries have to spend and invest and mobilise across a broad range of policies. And what we see in many countries is that the government will issue comprehensive cybersecurity strategies or comprehensive cyber strategies and then default to executing those that are the most easy to execute. And when governments confront difficulties and obstacles, they tend to retreat, or the bureaucrats or the people involved in the mobilisation tend to retreat. So it's fundamentally important for governments to invest across the board. Could you remind me of Antoine's question again, please, James?
Similar question, which is, if you're a policymaker and you're thinking, okay, I'd like to become better as a cyber power, IISS has these 7 areas, what should I be spending my scarce dollars or rubles or renminbi on?
Well, the report doesn't sort of quite come down on that question, but I think the implication of what we've revealed and analysed and assessed is that you have to start with the fundamentals of knowledge, of learning, of the education system. You have to invest in diplomacy. So if you're in a tier three country, you cannot be secure in cyberspace without securing the support of stronger countries who can help you in cyberspace to defend you. And I think what we'll see in Southeast Asia, for example, is a real strengthening of this mutual assistance impulse that has to come when countries find themselves confronted with the sorts of threats that they face. That's what we've seen in a sense from India. India has become much closer to the United States in cyber policy and trying to get benefits from that relationship as a result of the sorts of cyber attacks it's been experiencing. So we're actually seeing a trend, partly under the influence of more reporting of Chinese cyber attacks and Russian cyber attacks. We've seen a trend on the part of countries to try to get closer to the United States in cyber policy as some sort of insurance policy. But it's not just the United States. Countries like India are trying to work with the UK and France. Japan is trying to work with the UK. The short answer to where should they invest: diplomacy and education. And it's a long-term problem, 2 decades to 3 decades. Thanks.
Let's keep on India. So I had a couple of questions on India. A lot of our audience this evening came from India. And so let me pick one, which is Priyali Dhingra, who is a reporter for the Delhi Post. And she simply says, so what about India? Can you give us anything that was comparatively surprising? So India came in tier 3. You might think that India would do better. It has a lot of technology assets, including in areas like information security, very strong in IT sectors, a highly skilled engineering base. So in a sense, why isn't India doing better, or was India doing as well as you would have expected?
Well, it's a very challenging question. So I have some colleagues in India who challenged me on the ranking of India as a tier 3 country. I think that one of the reasons is that the government in India has moved relatively slowly compared with most in the last decade in terms of building on the early promise. So India's done some really interesting things in cyberspace that are unmatched in other countries. So whether it's in the legal system through cyber courts, so-called, or whether it's through the state governments in India, which some state governments in India have more people working on cybersecurity than some state governments in the United States do. And same for Australia. India has many more people in some of their state governments than in Australia. The private sector in India has been quite well mobilised through the Data Security Council of India, which is run by NASSCOM, the peak body for the ICT sector. So the government, in a sense, tardiness in really delivering strong policy direction, strong investment, hasn't really quite matched the very visible potential of India as a scientific and technological power, which, you know, it's got nuclear weapons, it's got missiles, it really is a scientific and technical power, but it really doesn't match that sort of capability. The government doesn't match that sort of capability with what it's doing. So I think that India doesn't quite make tier 2. Another reason is that we don't have a lot of information on India's intelligence organisations. So we know more about Chinese intelligence organisations and what they do in cyberspace, and about Russian intelligence organisations, than we know in the public domain about Indian intelligence organisations. So we may be missing the big picture. It will be good to know if we are. So we do acknowledge the sort of the paucity of information in this particular case. Thank you, James.
So we're coming towards not quite closing time, but getting on that way. So let's have crisp, quick answers to these last set of questions. So John Pumphrey, Colonel John Pumphrey, who's the Canadian Defence Attaché here in Singapore and a great friend of IISS Asia, he asks about cyber foreign policy and whether these cyber policies entail surveillance of their own citizens for national security reasons, and damage to privacy. I thought maybe this was something that Elina, you might like to look at, because you were talking about some of the risks of cyber policy. So to what extent do you see the building up of cyber capabilities coming hand in hand with problems of in a sense, civil liberties?
Yeah, in the US, for example, as people may know, the US government is prohibited from spying on its own nationals. That said, I think one of the distinctions between countries like the US and countries like China is going back to my first point about the role of the private sector. And in liberal democracies where private companies are flourishing in terms of data collection, there is a very real threat of what is called the surveillance capitalism industry. So we give up our information willingly, but private companies also take advantage of the information that we give up to expand their surveillance capabilities. And many of these private companies work very closely with intelligence agencies like the NSA. And so there is, going back to my point about this blurring of distinctions between what is public and what is private and how much intelligence is collected, one can make the argument that really the surveillance risk is almost equal in liberal democracies as it is in authoritarian regimes. I know that's a bit contrarian and there may be some pushback, but I will stick to that position.
Let me take a question from Odette Mayer, who describes himself here as a private investor. It says, can the panel elaborate on the contribution of free enterprise to relative strength in cyberspace? And so, Gil, I wondered if I could ask you that. It's an interesting question. Greg's already mentioned the fact that one of the strengths of the United States and countries like Israel, where you're based, is the private sector, the cybersecurity agencies. But typically, policymakers tend to think, well, you can just spend a lot of state money in this area and get better. That's maybe what the Chinese have been doing. So can you give us a perspective on how important the private sector is in assessing cyber power?
Well, it's a huge question, I think. Again, I can give the perspective here from Israel. We can see that the private sector, or the national investment in the private sector and in the cooperation between the universities and the private sector has proven itself. And Israel exports its technology, its cyber technology and cyber knowledge and information, and it contributes a lot to its economy. So in that sense, I think the contribution of the private sector is enormous.
Let me ask one more question, and then I'm going to go back to our panelists for a final question. And so this, since we're in Singapore, I'll come back to Singapore. So this is from Kin Peng Orr, who's from the Ministry of Health Holdings in Singapore. And Greg, this is one for you. I thought this was a really interesting question. So he asks, if the US is tier 1 and Russia is tier 2, then why does President Biden need to go to President Putin and start laying down red lines, as has happened and indeed happened with President Obama, and saying, if you do this, then we're going to do that? Why is it that if they're so good, why can't they just fight back through cyberspace? Why do we need why are countries trying to establish new norms in cyberspace or public forms of deterrence rather than simply relying on technological solutions?
Well, thanks, James. The United States is clearly in a difficult position. It came from around about the year 2000, 2002, when it was hopeful of great levels of international collaboration on cyberspace policy. You remember Y2K, the Russians and the Americans had observers monitoring key systems against the Y2K problem. But really by the early 2000s, that promise of cooperation began to dissipate. And by the time we got to 2013, the United States was issuing public demands to China to stop its commercial cyber espionage. At that point in time, that was just about the time, just months before, the crisis in Kiev led ultimately in 2014 to the Russian annexation of Crimea. So that was really the start point of the downturn in relations between the United States and Russia. Russia undertook aggressive and comprehensive cyber operations against Ukraine, and the United States found itself in this new position, having hoped for better with Russia, of having to come to terms with a more aggressive, more robust cyber actor. And it took them until 2018 to publish their policy called the Cyber Deterrence Initiative, so that's only several years. The Cyber Deterrence Initiative was premised on retaliation of some sort in cyberspace to dissuade the malicious actors, whether they were governmental or otherwise, from Russia and China. And so it's a long process, and you could say that it's been inconsistently delivered. So Obama set a line of deterrence policy. It was largely abandoned for the first 2 years of the Trump administration, and then Jim Mattis more or less got it up along with other high-ranking officials and officers, and Trump really didn't deliver on it, and Biden has had to go back, in a sense, to the stiffening of the Obama policy, because nothing really worked that well under Trump. Thank you.
Thank you. So that brings us very close to the end of our time. What I want to do is ask Greg one final question about where this is going to go next. But before I say that, any of you watching this evening, you can read this report for free on the IISS website, including the various country chapters. So if you're interested in Malaysia or India or North Korea or Iran, it's all there free to read. So let us know what you think. Greg, maybe you can close with just two things, just in 1 minute. So firstly, tell us if there was one thing in the world of cyber that you're interested in looking at more, something that's exciting and has caught your eye, then what would that be? And where does this research go from here? Because you're the head of our Cyberspace and Future Conflict program. This has been 2 years in the making, but this is really just the beginning of the work that IISS is going to be doing on cyber and other forms of technology. So give us a sense of what you're excited by at the moment, and where's this going to go next for us?
Well, thank you, James. The thing I'm most excited about is the evolution of the knowledge community globally around cyberspace operations, around malicious activity in cyberspace. We are far from consensus, but I think that it's really interesting to see how it's developing in sub-regions of the world. But globally, there's an appreciation of the need to come together and create a solid knowledge community. So that's really what I would hope for. Where does it fit in broader IISS work? I mentioned at the start that we're interested in studying cyber power for its own sake, but we really want to relate it to the use of cyber power in war, in future conflict, in situations short of war, and in support of diplomacy. And that particular topic is proving to be a great challenge to governments around the world. It's a question on everybody's lips. We saw at the high-level meeting between China and the United States in Anchorage just this year, where a senior Chinese official was calling the United States a champion of cyber attack. So we have a challenge. It's front and center of international politics, and the International Institute of Strategic Studies is keen to understand better and to work with our peers around the world to look at how we understand the use of cyber coercion, what's working and what's not, and ultimately how do we mitigate some of the tensions that are occurring. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you very much to Elina and to Gil. As I say, you can go and read all of this on our website. There's 15 national case studies up there. We're going to be doing more of them. So I think the plan is that we'll have some 40 in the near future. So we would be very grateful if you keep in touch with our work. And thank you very much for joining us here this evening. Thank you to Greg. Thank you to Gil. Thank you to Elina. Good night.